and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 36. The Assassin's Creed. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed religion in the Seljuk Empire, the mutual support agreement between the Seljuk and Abbasid dynasties, and how rigid Sunni orthodoxy was so critical to legitimizing the Seljuk regime. But we also discussed the ways that reality broke from theory, how the sultans and the caliphs came into conflict, the conflict among the Sunni madhabs, and the life of religious minorities, including Shia, Jews, and Christians. And as I said, when I was writing the episode, I really wanted to cover the rise of the Ismaili Nizaris, also called the Assassins. Because really, this is one of the most important and interesting parts of the Seljuk legacy. But as I was writing the episode, the story of the Assassins just ballooned out of all control, and I felt that I'd rather do a good job covering it instead of shortening it and fitting it into a broader religion episode. Additionally, this is a good opportunity to cover some of the background on the Fatimid Caliphate that would sort of add a broader context to the narrative. So this is basically a mini episode to try to give the Assassins their due. After this episode, there will be one more non-narrative episode on culture in the Seljuk Empire before we finally turn to Anatolia. Like so much about the Nizari assassins, their origins are shrouded in mystery. But the Assassins started out as a splinter group of a splinter group of a splinter group. And to understand their origins, we need to step back a bit and briefly cover the history of Shi'ism. Something I probably should have spent more time on in the narrative, to be honest. See, as we have discussed back in our original episodes on the beginnings of Islam, following the death of Muhammad, the Muslim world, the Ummah, split into two camps. In the minority, the Shi'at Ali, the party of Ali, who wanted Ali to succeed the messenger. And in the majority, the Sunni, those who coalesced around the messenger's favorite wife Aisha, her father Abu Bakr, and the great general Umar. As we discussed in the narrative, the Sunnis of course basically won, and Ali was eventually outmaneuvered by the Sunni Muawiyah and the Umayyads before being stabbed to death by a Kharijite fanatic. But this was not the end of the Shi'at Ali, the party of Ali, who became in time the Shia. And they continued to exist, pining for the return of the line of Ali. These descendants of Ali, who succeeded him, came to take the title that Ali had borne, Imam, meaning he who stands in front. The modest title, taken by the man who leads the Friday prayers. But for the first 250-odd years of Islam, they were never really able to come to political power, despite the attempts of their followers in the fitnas. Always, the Shia were outmaneuvered by the Umayyads or the Abbasids, and the Imams remained as dissident leaders, largely drawing upon the anger of the poor and the dispossessed. Therefore, after the victory of Abu Muslim in the third fitna, under the Abbasids, a close eye was kept on the Imams, and after the move to Samarra, the Imams were basically kept locked up in a prison cell in Samarra under the watchful eyes of the Turkish slave soldiers. There they lived their lives in confinement, hidden from their followers, and mostly ended up getting poisoned to death. In such an environment, where the leader was kept apart from his flock and the Shia faced constant persecution, the leadership of the imamate, of course, naturally came into question. And soon, a division came to emerge as to who the imam was and how many imams were legitimate. the vast majority of Shia ended up accepting 12 Imams, leading to them being called Twelvers. Twelver Shi'ism is the predominant form of Shi'ism to this day. Twelvers believe that the final Imam is Muhammad ibn Hassan, whose father Hassan ibn Ali was murdered in 874 on the orders of Caliph al-Mu'tamid during the anarchy at Samarra. Now, if you'll recall from our episodes on the anarchy, Shia revolts were breaking out all over Iraq and Syria at this time, and the state was in total crisis. The Turkish slave generals were running the show in Baghdad and Samarra, and everywhere. The authority of the central state was slipping away and falling to the emirs. And in this environment, with Shia revolts erupting everywhere, it seems that the Abbasid authorities may have decided to not just finish off Hassan ibn Ali, but his son Muhammad. Certainly, the references to Muhammad ibn Hassan cease, and he seems to have disappeared around the time of his father's murder as the anarchy raged. But while many people believe that both father and son were thus killed by the Abbasid authorities during the anarchy, Twelver Shia do not accept this. Instead, they believe that Muhammad ibn Hassan is the Mahdi, the figure prophesied to appear before the end of days to herald the return of Jesus and thus bring about the end of the world. Instead of being killed in Samarra, the Twelvers believe that he became occluded. That is, he is hidden from the world, kept safe by Allah, until the time that he can be revealed in safety. Until such time, the Mahdi roams the world, living among us, hidden, but sustained and protected by Allah until he chooses to reveal himself, and thus bring about the day of judgment. Indeed, ever since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini and the other leaders of the Islamic Republic famously keep an empty chair at all cabinet meetings, in case the Mahdi wishes to reveal himself and take his rightful seat. But not all Shia accept this. See, during the captivity of the Imams by the Abbasids, there was a succession dispute following the death of the sixth Imam, the widely respected and revered Jafar al-Sadiq. Jafar was a real giant of a man, a great scholar of Islamic law, history, theology, and philosophy, respected not only by the Shia, but by the Sunnis. And while he lived, according to many sources, he wanted his son Ismail to succeed him as Imam. But then, Ismail died shortly before Jafar, likely having been poisoned by the Abbasid authorities and leaving as his heir his son Muhammad ibn Ismail, that is, Jafar's grandson. Eventually, Jafar was then poisoned as well. Honestly, being poisoned by the Abbasids was a real occupational hazard for the Shia Imams. Following this, the majority of the Shia community recognized Jafar's younger son Musa al-Kazim as Imam. But a minority recognized Jafar's grandson, Ismail's son, Muhammad ibn Ismail, as Imam. Ibn Ismail then died sometime in the late 8th century during the reign of Harun al-Rashid of unknown causes. If I had to guess, I would put being poisoned at the top of the list of possibilities. His followers came to be called Ismailis after him. Now, the majority of Ismailis at the time recognized no further Imams after Ibn Ismail. They came to be called Karmatis, or Seveners, as they recognized only 7 Imams. But according to a minority of Ismailis, before Ibn Ismail died, he handed over the control of his nascent movement to his son Ahmad, who would then go on to lead another section of the community as Imam. These Ismailis fled the persecution in the heartland of the Abbasid Caliphate, now living in the end of its glory days before the anarchy, to the west. They passed Egypt and came to settle in North Africa, in the deserts and remote cities far from the reach of the Abbasid authorities. There, They converted Berber and Bedouin tribes of the desert to their sect of Shi'ism, in particular, a Berber tribe called the Kutama in modern Algeria. Slowly, as the golden age of the Abbasids neared its end, they built in the far west of the Muslim world a dedicated religious order powered by these fearsome desert warriors. Now, the differences between the two main branches of Shi'ism are more than about who was the Imam or how many Imams there are. Just as the split between Sunni and Shia started out as a succession dispute, but then evolved into distinct approaches to Islamic law, different theological and philosophical beliefs, different eschatological beliefs, and different structures of organization, so too did the split between the Twelvers and the Ismailis come to result in different religious sects. The biggest difference ultimately came from Ismailism's interaction with Greek philosophy, in particular Plato, and his theory of forms. That is, that ideas, and not the material world, are the highest form of reality. Ismailism was also deeply influenced by the early Christian school of Gnosticism. From this, Ismailis came to adopt a belief in what are essentially two different worlds: a material world of darkness, and then an inner, hidden world of light. They adopted an esoteric interpretation of the Quran and the Hadith, one that focused on finding the inner meaning hidden within the text. And they also took from Gnostic thought the importance of the number 7, which Gnostics saw as the most important number. At that time, humans knew of only 7 planets. There were the fabled 7 climes of the world. There are 7 days to the week. The number 7 was seen as the perfect or complete number in the Hebrew Bible, and the books of the Christian Bible were traditionally divided into 7 divisions. This belief in the importance of the number 7 was brought into Ismailism, and even among those Ismailis who followed Ahmad into the West, the number 7 came to have great importance to them. Ismailism adopted 7 pillars of belief, as opposed to the classic Islamic 5 pillars, and came to believe that prophets and imams came in series of 7. Connected to this belief in inner and outer meanings and the importance of the number 7 was a belief entirely new to Islam: a belief in the cyclical movement of time. Again, this was highly influenced by Greek philosophy, in particular Plato and Aristotle, but it also drew from Hinduism and Buddhism. Essentially, Ismailis came to believe that time was to be composed of 7 total cycles of divine revelation, each defined by a speaker or natik, who was assisted by a representative or wasi. The speaker would expound the revelation, while the representative would understand its hidden meaning and reveal it to the elect. The first 6 speakers were Adam, assisted by Seth, Noah, assisted by Shem, Abraham, assisted by Ismail, Moses, assisted by Aaron, Jesus, assisted by Simon Peter, and Muhammad, assisted by Ali. The 7th was to be the Mahdi, and before the Mahdi's arrival, the community was to be led by the line of Ali, imams repeating in series of 7 until the coming of the final imam. And according to some sources, at least some Ismailis came to believe in reincarnation as part of this cyclical movement of time, that the natik and the wasi were in fact reborn in each iteration of the cycle, and for some Ismailis, perhaps all humans were to be reborn in this 7-fold cycle. And fittingly for a sect born under the watchful eyes of the Abbasid authorities and possessing ideas that would be seen as heretical by most Muslims, perhaps even amounting to apostasy, Ismailism became in many ways a secret faith. An inner faith of spiritual truth, hidden within the outer world of material darkness as Gnostics would have seen it. And basically uniquely among Muslims, this led to the development of a highly structured and secretive religious order. Remember, the Messenger's faith has always had a strong anti-clerical streak in it. Muhammad taught that priests would stand between man and God, and in a sense interfered with the radical unity of Allah. Only God should be worshipped, not a priest. Additionally, priests inevitably became a wealthy class, separate from the people, and Muhammad had of course disdained what he saw as the hypocritical pagan priests of Arabia. Men who lived lavishly worshipping idols, instead of living simply, worshipping the one God. And so, Islam has no ordained clergy. It has no initiation ceremonies like baptism, no rituals of worship that require a priest to perform. Even a person leading prayers or delivering the khutbah is just a believer like everyone else, and he has no power or authority over his fellows. In most places, he's just a respected and pious member of the community taking the task on for himself. No one is supposed to stand between the believer and Allah. According to most Muslims, all it takes to be a Muslim is to recite the Shahada and believe in its words, that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. Not so with the Ismailis, who built a hidden religious world full of secret ranks and initiation ceremonies and layers of meaning and power, all of which extended down from the Imams. For the Ismailis, Imam ceased to be a humble title. The Imam is not just a man who leads prayers for his brothers, but rather the Imam, with a capital I, the head of their community and organization, appointed by Allah to lead. This movement, this organization, was called by the Ismailis the Dawah, or the mission. The Dawah was of course led by the Imam, but under him there were, predictably, 7 ranks. We don't know the names of each rank, but the highest rank was the Da'i, or the missionary. The Da'is would spread out across the Muslim world, gathering members and inducting them into the secret faith of the Ismaili, revealing to them the inner truth to illuminate the world of darkness. And so the Dawah, the mission, came to be both extremely secretive and rigidly hierarchical. And crucially connected to this unique structure, this importance of the imamate and the highly structured religious order was a belief in the power of the imam to interpret religion and religious law. Unlike Sunnis and even the Twelver Shia, who believe fundamentally in various schools of thought in how to interpret the Hadith and the Quran, the Ismailis came to believe that the imam himself had the ultimate interpretive power. In line with their Gnostic thoughts, the Ismailis came to believe that the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sharia had an outer, or zahir meaning, and an inner, or batin meaning. And only the imams had the ability to understand and expound the true inner meaning. Therefore, the Ismaili imams had a power to interpret and guide and shape the religion in a way that Sunni caliphs simply didn't. In some senses, the imam could make the religion. He was seen as the arbiter of religious truth, the guardian of the inner light, the inner truth, hidden beneath this outer world of material darkness. And this secretive religious order, led by Ibn Ismail's descendants, though by far the minority of the Shia, did ultimately get their due. Because it was they who would go on to found the Fatimid Caliphate. As the anarchy in Samarra raged, the Turkish Tulanid dynasty arose in Egypt, and the Ahlabid dynasty of emirs came to power in North Africa. Naturally, the Tulanids and the Ahlabids came to blows, fighting a series of battles in the 880s, and the Ahlabids were stretched thin by their campaigns in Sicily. And as North Africa thus fell into chaos during the anarchy, the local Ismaili Da'i, a man named Abu Abdullah al-Shi, powered by his Kutama Berber warriors, was able to drive out the Ahlabids. While the Ahlabid princes fought on in Sicily, Abu Abdullah launched a war that took North Africa from them. In 902, the Ismaili Imam Abdullah al-Mahdi joined Abu Abdullah in the recently conquered Ahlabid capital of Kairouan in Tunisia. And in 909, The last Aghlabid prince died fighting Abu Abdullah in what is now Lares, Tunisia. All of North Africa was now in Ismaili hands, and in January 910, the Imam Abdullah al-Mahdi declared himself to be the Caliph, inaugurating in North Africa the Fatimid Caliphate. Taking its name from Muhammad's daughter Fatima, from whom they claimed descent, the Ismaili Fatimids created the first truly Shia state. Meanwhile, the Turkish Tulunids had been defeated and driven out of Egypt by an Abbasid expeditionary force in 905. But Abbasid rule in Egypt was very tenuous. As we discussed in the narrative, the anarchy at Samarra had resulted in the Abbasids being effectively incapable of holding territories outside of Iraq. Ultimately, Baghdad simply did not have the ability to defend the rich lands of Egypt and keep it in the fold. And so yet another Turkish slave dynasty arose in Egypt, the Ikshidid dynasty. But like the Tulunids, the Ikshidids were basically foreign Turkish slave soldiers without a deep base of support in Egypt, while the Fatimids had a deep well of support among the powerful Berber tribes of North Africa. Quickly, the Fatimids consolidated their control over the region west of Egypt. They formed a regional power, conquering Sicily and invading as far west as Morocco and even Umayyad Spain, just as in Egypt, Ikshidid rule began to falter. And so, powered by their wild Berber warriors and led by their disciplined religious order of Shia zealots, the Fatimids began launching devastating raids of Egypt against the tottering Ikshidid dynasty. Ikshidid rule became increasingly fragile as the Turkish slave emirs faced both bad harvests caused by poor Nile floods and Berber and Nubian raiding, becoming steadily weakened. In 968, the last Ikshidid emir died without an heir, leading to internal chaos in Egypt. And thus, finally, in 969, under the leadership of the Fatimid Caliph Al-Mu'iz il-Din Allah, the Fatimids succeeded in toppling the remnants of the Ikshidid Emirate and conquering Egypt. And upon entering the Egyptian capital of Fustat in triumph, the commanding Fatimid general ordered the construction of a new fortified capital to be built immediately adjacent to it. Just as Fustat had been founded as a barrack city by Muslim invaders proclaiming a new faith, so too would this new sect found their own capital in Egypt, named by the new Imam Caliph Al-Mu'iz as Qahirat Al-Mu'iz, the vanquisher of Al-Mu'iz. We know it, of course, as Cairo. Under Fatimid rule, Egypt flourished and became a great center of the Muslim world. Really, the center of the Muslim world. In the new city of Cairo, vast palaces were built, and wealth flowed into the country. As the Abbasid dynasty languished as virtual prisoners of the mostly Twelver Shia Buyid dynasty, and as Iran fell into their rule, Cairo came to supplant Baghdad in many ways. No Muslim realm was wealthier or more sophisticated, or even, with the exception of the Ghaznavids far to the east, more militarily powerful. The Fatimids conquered the Levant and Syria, and even crossed from Egypt into the Hejaz, taking the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, becoming the custodians of the holiest sites of Islam. In Yemen, another Ismaili state came into existence, indirectly ruled from Cairo. And as we discussed in the narrative, even in Constantinople, the emperor of the Romans ordered the khutbah in the mosque of the city to be read in the name of the Fatimid Caliphs. And as the Fatimids ruled North Africa, Sicily, and Egypt, and took up the mantle of the leading Muslim state in the world, Ismaili Shi'ism grew, not only in Egypt, but throughout the Muslim world, though it remained, even now, a minority sect when compared to Twelverism. Indeed, with the Buyids in power in Iran and Iraq, and the Fatimid Caliphate as the richest and most powerful state in the Muslim world, it would seem that the Shia, and in particular the Ismaili Imam Caliphs, had finally achieved supremacy. Ali had called his years being denied the caliphate his years of dust and thorns. and it must have seemed to many Shia that only now had those years of dust and thorns finally ended after centuries of persecution. Surely this was the will of Allah, the righteous Shia finally receiving their due after centuries of humiliation. Nothing could possibly challenge this, right? Cue the Seljuks. See, the coming of the Seljuks from the east upended this Shia ascendancy. The Seljuk conquests freed the Abbasid Caliphs from their imprisonment by the Shia Buyids and united Iran, Khorasan, Balkh, and Iraq under a strong Sunni state, a power that the Sunnis had not seen since the days of the Abbasid Caliphate in many ways. As we discussed last time, this led to a Sunni revivalism throughout the vast empire, and in time, the Seljuks would come to push the Fatimids from Syria and the Levant, and even from the Hejaz. The name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad was once again read in the khutbah in the holy mosques of Mecca and Medina. And as we discussed in the narrative, Atsuz was even able to invade Egypt itself. Meanwhile, the Fatimid Caliphate entered into a decline that we briefly touched on in the narrative. Civil war and conflict arising between the Imam Caliph, his viziers, his Turkish slave army, and the tribes of the Sahara Desert. The great Ismaili Shia power dimmed as the Seljuks took up the mantle of the greatest Muslim power in the world, and as the Shia throughout this young Seljuk empire were put on the back foot. And it was in this environment that a man was born in Iran who would go on to essentially found a new sect of Shi'ism and the famous order of the Assassins. Hassan is-Sabah. Hassan was a Persian, born in the city of Qom in the year 1050 to a Twelver Shia family. In other words, he was born in Iran just as Tughral was conquering Iran and Iraq and really building the Seljuk Empire. And remember, as we discussed in the narrative and in our last episode, defending Sunni orthodoxy was a critical part of Tughral negotiating his way into power. And therefore, under the Seljuks, persecutions of the Shia began again, though as we discussed last time, we should not think of this as a constant. And as the Seljuks advanced, even conquering Iraq and Iran, a great Sunni Turkish empire came to be established in the old heartlands of the Abbasid Caliphate, much to the fear and hatred of many of the Iranian Shia. And the Fatimids, facing this growing Sunni power from the east, of course began working to undermine it. As we saw in the narrative, this included trying to get the Shia slave general al-Basasiri to switch sides, but it in general meant trying to co-opt the Twelver Shia in the young Seljuk Empire to their side. And these efforts were somewhat successful. Ismailism came to grow in Iran, and indeed throughout the Seljuk Empire. This is largely because, more than anyone, it was the Ismailis, with the backing of Cairo, who were confronting the Seljuks and the Sunnism that they were imposing throughout the land. But it was also because the strictly hierarchical structures of the secretive Ismaili order made them exceptionally well organized and disciplined. And many Twelver Shia in Iran left the more orthodox form of Shi'ism for the Ismailism of the court in Cairo. And so it was that Hassan left the Twelverism of his youth and became an Ismaili. He was inducted into the secret order of the Ismailis in Iran and rose through the ranks. He became a deep and committed believer in the principles of Ismailism, as well as a believer that only the Ismailis could deliver his homeland from Sunni rule, and indeed from Turkish rule. Hassan hated not only that his homeland was ruled by Sunnis, but also that it was under the rule of a bunch of Turkish savages from the steppes. And Hassan came to believe that only the Ismailis could stand up to the Seljuks and free Iran. Hassan eventually became the leader of the Ismaili Shia underground in Iran, opposed to the House of Seljuk, Turkish rule, and the imposition of Sunni orthodoxy. But ultimately, Hassan came under suspicion by the Seljuk authorities. As the Seljuk state consolidated and began to increasingly crack down on these religious Ismailis, Hassan was forced to flee the empire. He fled Iran, crossing Iraq and the Levant, and finally came to Cairo itself. According to some sources, the reason for this was that he had attracted the attention of the Seljuk authorities directly, including Nizam ul-Mulk, and needed to flee to save his life. And so Hassan came to Egypt during the reign of the Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Muntansir Billah. And it was during al-Muntansir's long reign that the great acts that we discussed in the narrative played out. The rebellion of the Fatimid Turkish slave army, the Fatimid loss of the Hejaz, the holy cities, Syria and the Levant to the Seljuks, the war against the Nubians, and the invasion of Atsuz. And as we discussed in the narrative, this chaos led to the rise of the great Fatimid general Badr al-Jamali and his consolidation of power over the Fatimid state. But by the time that Hassan came to Cairo, Atsuz's invasion had been driven back, and due to the relentless efforts of Badr, the Fatimid Caliphate was now back on solid footing. And thus Badr al-Jamali was now, in many ways, the real master of Fatimid Egypt, especially as the Imam Caliph al-Muntansir aged. But Hassan quickly came to be disliked by Badr after his arrival in Egypt. Perhaps the great general saw him as a potential foe, as Hassan was the charismatic leader of the Ismailis in Iran. Perhaps they just personally didn't get along. Likely it was a bit of both. Whatever the exact causes, they became fierce rivals. And naturally, the two men came to support different candidates to succeed the aging Fatimid Caliph al-Muntansir Billah. Hassan cast his support behind al-Muntansir's eldest son, Nizar, whereas General Badr supported the youngest of all of al-Muntansir's sons, a man named al-Mustali. Likely, he hoped that he would be able to thoroughly dominate the young man. But as Badr grew more powerful, Cairo became an uncomfortable place for Hassan. After being briefly imprisoned by Badr, Hassan decided that staying in Cairo would be hazardous for his health. And perhaps more importantly, he still hoped to succeed in his mission of overthrowing the Seljuks and establishing an Ismaili state in Iran. General Badr, happy to see the back of his rival, seems to have agreed to provide Hassan and his men with financial support to return to Iran and start a revolution to overthrow the Seljuks, or at least undermine them. And so, in 1081, Hassan returned to the east with a small band of supporters, to a Seljuk empire now ruled by Nizam ul-Mulk and Melik Shah, and living in its golden age, under al-Dawla al-Nizamiya. By now, Hassan had become a committed Ismaili revolutionary, absolutely dedicated to his spiritual political mission, the overthrow of Turkish Sunni power and the establishment of a proper, righteous, Iranian Ismaili state. And once back in Iran with his small group, Hassan began preaching, spreading his revolutionary message. With their purses full of Fatimid gold, Hassan and his men traveled Iran, converting Shia and Sunni alike to Ismailism. And they seem to have been particularly effective in the north of Iran and in parts of Syria. Slowly, this secretive Ismaili network began to grow, a network that was of course dedicated to the overthrow of Seljuk power. There are indications in the sources that soon several towns and maybe even small fortresses in northern Iran were in the hands of the Ismaili revolutionaries. But Hassan's return and preaching did not go unnoticed. The elderly Nizam ul-Mulk was of course alerted to his arrival and the growth of his movement, and the Seljuk authorities constantly pursued this group of Ismaili revolutionaries. Hassan and his men were forced to constantly flee, moving around northern Iran, always just one step ahead of the Seljuk authorities. Finally, in 1090, Hassan and his men came upon the remote fortress of Alamut in far northern Iran. Perched on the very top of a high and inaccessible mountain deep in the Alborz Mountains near the city of Qazvin, about 100 kilometers to the northwest of modern-day Tehran, Alamut was truly defensible. The fortress sat on top of steep and high cliffs and was only accessible via narrow passes winding up through the tall mountain. Here, in this remote mountain fortress, Hassan established the headquarters of his order of mystic Shia revolutionaries, what he hoped to be the nucleus of an Ismaili state in Iran. And sitting here, in his isolated mountain fortress in northern Iran, deep behind enemy lines in the Seljuk Empire and far from the Fatimid court back in Cairo, naturally, Hassan became increasingly functionally independent from Badr, though he continued to enjoy Fatimid support for now. But shortly after Hassan's arrival in Alamut, there came a final break with his patrons back in Egypt. Because in 1094, a mere 4 years after Hassan's arrival at the fortress in Alamut, the elderly Fatimid Imam Caliph Al-Muntansir Billah died. Naturally, Badr was able to use this opportunity to place his chosen heir, Al-Mustali, on the throne. But of course, Hassan and his men in Alamut were not going to accept this. Instead, they proclaimed loyalty to Hassan's chosen successor, Al-Muntansir Billah's eldest son, Nizar. And it was from this support for Nizar that Hassan's sect would take its name, the Nizaris. Relations with Cairo were therefore severed. But Nizar, of course, was not in Alamut. He was back in Cairo, in fact, leading an open revolt against al-Mustali that would shortly end in his execution in Alexandria. His descendants, the men to whom the Ismailis in Alamut would claim to look for leadership, were then held to be in concealment. They were therefore incapable of leading the Ismailis now in the Seljuk Empire, spread out across northern Iran and Syria, with their leaders hunkered down in the mountain fortress of Alamut. And thus, the leadership of this Nizari sect was actually exercised on the ground in Alamut not by an imam, but by Hassan-i Sabah. Indeed, Hassan's refusal to recognize al-Mustali and his successors in Cairo effectively led to a new sect of Ismailism under his control. An extremely fringe sect that was a minority of a minority of a minority of the Muslim world. And the beliefs and practices of the Nizaris were very much stamped by the world that gave birth to them. Nizari Ismailism inherited the traditions of Ismailism that were born during the faith's youth, when it was a persecuted faith in the Abbasid Caliphate. But it was also profoundly shaped by its emergence in the Seljuk Empire. It was a faith born in a remote mountain fortress controlled by a revolutionary leader dreaming of liberating Iran from the Sunni Turks who now ruled it. A faith of people living in a hostile world, detested and feared by the powers of the day and even the bulk of the population. And it showed. Like other Ismailis, the Nizaris were an extremely hierarchical and secretive religious order. But their practices and beliefs soon diverged from the Ismailis who followed Cairo. Firstly, in keeping with his Iranian sympathies and desire to free Iran from these Turkish savages, Hassan changed the language of faith from Arabic to Persian. This was a huge deal. According to traditional Islamic views, Arabic has a special status as the language the Quran was revealed in. Indeed, so central is the Arabic language that translations of the Quran aren't really considered to be the real deal. They are considered to just be aids in understanding the Quran or commentaries on it. Changing the language of religion to Persian was therefore a massive breach with tradition and Islamic orthodoxy. But it also helped Hassan spread his new faith in Iran, where the rule of the Turks was not universally loved. Theologically, Hassan expanded the Ismaili notion of ta'lim, that is, that the imam is the ultimate arbiter on religious matters. Hassan held that the interpretive authority of each imam living in his time was absolute. Or in other words, spiritual truth is whatever the imam says it is. This amounted to a complete and total rejection of not only the various Sunni and Twelver Shia approaches to analysis of the Quran and the Hadith, but went further than even the Ismailis back in Cairo. To the Nizaris, the imam came to be, in essence, infallible. And since the imam wasn't around in Alamut, well, naturally, that meant that his deputy had the authority to interpret himself. And thus, Hassan cemented his control over the highly secretive and rigidly hierarchical Ismaili organization operating in the lands of the Seljuk Empire. And it was here, in the isolated fortress of Alamut, following the break with Cairo, that the unique practices of the Nizaris arose. As with other Ismailis, they practiced a form of Islam deeply influenced by Gnosticism and Greek philosophy. That is, they believed in a material world of darkness that hid within it a spiritual world of light. This was indeed part of what gave the imam his infallible spiritual authority. He was the person who could pierce through the outer, material meaning of the Quran and the Sharia and reveal their inner, spiritual meaning. And from this, the Nizaris developed a unique belief in both the importance and holiness of the imam and indeed of themselves. Termed resurrection or qiyamah, basically, they came to believe that the imam himself, now in hiding in Egypt, had risen to a new level of existence, to become the manifestation of truth himself. The imam would become the Qayyim Qiyamah, the Lord of resurrection, the perfect person, utterly infallible in spiritual matters, and who alone could break apart the dark material world. And as they rose through the ranks of their secretive and hierarchical organization, as the truth, the inner world of light, came to be revealed to them through the imam and his deputies, they themselves would come to rise to a new level of existence. And this, of course, carried the dangerous corollary that those who had not risen to this level, those who did not have the understanding of this hidden light, this hidden truth, were in essence spiritually non-existent. And we all know what people are capable of doing when they see outsiders as spiritually non-existent. In particular, outsiders who persecute them and are seen as foreign enemies and heretics. And so, Hassani Sabah, now the absolute leader of this Ismaili sect, ruling from his isolated mountain fortress at Alamut, launched his revolutionary war against the House of Seljuk. These men who embodied the dark and evil material world opposed to his inner spiritual world of light. And he attempted to liberate Iran from these Turkish savages and establish the rule of the just. In other words, to overthrow the order of the evil material world and establish the rule of the Lord of Resurrection. Hassan's revolt spread out from Alamut, much to the consternation of Nizam-ul-Mulk and Melik Shah, who by now were of course beginning to turn on each other as we discussed in the narrative. As al-Dawla al-Nizamiya began to wobble, Ismaili forces made advances in Syria and Iran. They were able to capture a handful of small fortresses in northern Iran and in the mountains of western Syria. But more importantly, Hassan began to teach that the way to achieve real victory was to end the authorities themselves. To exterminate these leaders, the Nizaris had come to believe were not just enemies, or even just wrongly guided, but indeed the very embodiment of evil, manifestations of darkness and materiality, who weren't even really spiritually human in a meaningful sense. Only by ending these leaders, the savage Turks imposing Sunni rule and their Persian quislings, could their people, the true believers, be kept safe from persecution, and could their religious revolution succeed. And so Hassan adopted the tactic that would make his order famous and feared: the tactic of assassination. As we discussed in the narrative, the first major assassination conducted by the Nizaris was, of course, Nizam-ul-Mulk himself. Likely, Hassan had conspired with Melik Shah or Tarkan Khatun to accomplish this. This, of course, was the beginning of the end of al-Dawla al-Nizamiyya and the eruption of civil war. And after al-Dawla al-Nizamiyya ended, as the Seljuk state fractured, there would, of course, be many, many more. In time, the ability of the Lord of Alamut, first Hassan and then his successors, to summon and direct the assassins would make the Nizaris feared throughout the world, though their goal of creating an actual Nizari state never really reached fruition. At best, they would control pockets of Syria, northern Iran, and Yemen. But even if they did not succeed in creating a state for the Lord of Resurrection, they did succeed in scaring the pants off basically everyone else. Because in their quest to achieve their great revolution and to protect themselves from an extremely hostile world, countless political leaders would meet their end. Seljuk officials, viziers, qadis, governors, princes, and in time, even crusaders and Mongols would fall under Nizari blades as the Nizari struggle against the powers of the material world on behalf of the Lord of Resurrection unfolded. Indeed, our current word assassin is derived from the Nizaris, from the slur hashashin that Sunni Muslims hurled at them. There are several potential origins of this. Most likely, it derives from the Arabic word hashish, a slur against the Nizaris from other Muslims, meaning the hashish eaters. See, there are some indications in the sources that the Nizaris may have used hashish in their religious rituals. Marco Polo, for example, writes the following of the gardens at Alamut built by Hassan and his successors. He had caused a certain valley between two mountains to be enclosed, and had turned it into a garden, the largest and most beautiful that ever was seen, filled with every variety of fruit. In it were erected pavilions and palaces, the most elegant that can be imagined, all covered with gilding and exquisite painting. And there were runnels too, flowing freely with wine and milk and honey and water, and numbers of ladies and of the most beautiful damsels in the world, who could play on all manner of instruments, and sung most sweetly, and danced in a manner that was charming to behold. For the old man desired to make his people believe that this was actually paradise. Now no man was allowed to enter the garden, save those whom he had intended to be his ashashin. There was a fortress at the entrance to the garden, strong enough to resist all the world, and there was no other way to get in. He kept at his court a number of the youths of the country, from 12 to 20 years of age, such as had a taste for soldiering, and to these he used to tell the tales about paradise, just as Muhammad had been wont to do, and they believed in him, just as the Saracens believed in Muhammad. Then he would introduce them into his garden, some 4 or 6 or 10 at a time, having first made them drink a certain potion, which cast them into a deep sleep, and then causing them to be lifted and carried in. So when they awoke, they found themselves in the garden. When therefore they awoke, and found themselves in a place so charming, they deemed that it was paradise in very truth. And the ladies and damsels dallied with them to their heart's content, so that they had what young men would have, and with their own good, they would never have quitted that place. Now that is pretty interesting, and does seem to align with Nizari views regarding the material versus spiritual worlds. The Da'i taking his followers from the material world to this inner hidden paradise, like taking the sleepers out of Plato's cave. And the potion mentioned by Marco Polo reportedly is a drink full of hashish. But at the same time, we can't forget that Marco Polo, like basically all of the authors of the day, is very hostile to the Nizaris. Therefore, we sort of can't trust this anecdote or the attestations of hashish use in general. And indeed, we need to take all contemporary sources on the Nizaris with a great deal of skepticism. Regardless of the origin of the word, it is quite telling that this is where it came from. The practices of the Order of Assassins, their chosen methods to protect themselves and achieve their religio-political revolution, burned themselves into the consciousness of Muslims and Christians alike. Muslim authors wrote lurid stories of the depraved, drug-addicted assassins, hiding out in their mountain fortress and striking down the righteous with impunity. And soon the Crusaders would carry these stories back to Western Europe, along with stories of Crusaders themselves falling under the blades of the assassins. And so, the legend of the assassins grew, and it became infused with a deep hostility and indeed fear of the non-Ismaili authors. Hostility and fear that has colored our perceptions of the Nizaris and comes down to us to the present day. We should never forget that the tactics adopted by the assassins were at least in part a response to the hostile world the faith found itself in. Yes, on some level, they were revolutionaries dedicated to overthrowing Turkish Sunni power. But on another level, they were also people trying to practice their faith while basically being seen as heretics and apostates by most Muslims. Their strategy of assassination was, in many ways, their method of surviving this hostile world. It wasn't the cornerstone of their faith, and in time, it would be laid by the wayside by the Nizaris. The peak of the assassins' power was in the late 12th century under the reign of the Syrian da'i Rashid ad-Din Sinan, famously called the Old Man of the Mountain by the Crusaders. Under the leadership of the Old Man of the Mountain, for a period of about 30 years, the Syrian Nizaris consolidated control over a patchwork of castles and fortifications in the mountains of Latakia on the Mediterranean shore. Through the tactics of assassination and shifting alliances among the Crusaders, Saladin, the Zangids, and the Sultans of Rum, the Old Man of the Mountain was able to keep his community safe in the upheaval of the Crusades and the conquests of Saladin. Famously, after Saladin began making noises about finishing off the Nizaris in Syria, he awoke one morning to find a dagger planted in the pillow next to his head. The dagger pinned to the pillow a note asking him to reconsider. Shaken, he made peace with the Old Man of the Mountain. And in Iran, the Ismaili state centered in Alamut continued to persist as the Khwarezm Shahs came to power and various Turkic dynasties battled it out in Azerbaijan. Eventually, of course, the Syrian Nizaris would submit to Saladin and his descendants, and their independent power would be broken. However, the Nizaris would continue to exist in the region, with many groups ultimately evolving into the Druze and the Alawi communities we know today. And the Order of Assassins itself would continue until the Mongol destruction of Alamut in 1256, revenge for a failed assassination of a Mongol prince. But Nizariism continued even after the fall of Alamut and the end of the Order of the Assassins. With their temporal political power broken, the great fortresses lost, the Nizaris dispersed across the Muslim world. Nizari leaders would disguise themselves as Sufi mystics, secretly practicing a faith that had come to be seen as a blood-soaked heresy by the vast majority of Muslims, Shia and Sunni alike. Yet they still endured in Syria and northern Iran, and small but growing communities of Nizaris emerged in eastern Iran, Central Asia, and India. Eventually, Nizariism would even come to be the dominant form of Ismaili Islam. And even the Nizari Imams continued. In time, they would move to India, transforming into the Aga Khans. There they would survive not only the Mughal Empire, but the British Raj. Today, Nizaris are mostly found in India, Pakistan, and Tajikistan, with a very small community hanging on in Syria. Basically, after the destruction of Alamut and the loss of their Syrian citadels, the famed and fearsome order of assassins has faded into just another religious community in the Muslim world. And the current Aga Khan, of course, leads the Ismaili community not from an isolated mountain fortress, but from a rather well-appointed chateau in the vicinity of Paris. No longer a mystic Shia fanatic dedicated to the overthrow of the rulers of the material world, but a fixture of the jet set. A man who was known for his love of skiing and horse racing, with a net worth of over $1 billion and properties all over the world. How the wheel turns.